the British monarch's legacy in Southern Africa has been that of land and mineral dispositions from the natives, or should I say dispossessions. Now, some critics have put the blame on Queen Elizabeth II's great-grandmother, that's Queen Victoria, for paving the way. Joining me now to talk about the legacy, the trail of the British monarchy on the continent and its impact, particularly here in Southern Africa, is Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. He's a lawyer and author of the book, and you know it very well. It's called Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. Advocate, good to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
And you decided to make this journey specifically on this day because you are that passionate about this subject. Let me start off with the question about, on a day that the British public prepares to lay to rest their longest serving monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, how should the people of not just South Africa but the continent where the British Empire touched or changed lives possibly forever, how should they be reacting on a day like this?
I mean, there is obviously the distinction between Elizabeth, the person. Many Africans take seriously the idea of death and empathize with a person who has lost a loved one. But that must be distinguished from the legacy of the British royal family. People from Southern Africa, natives from Southern Africa, have deep scars that arise from the conduct, duplicitous conduct, and the conduct of the ancestors of Queen Elizabeth II. The most significant of those ancestors was her own great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who ruled from 1837 to 1901. Before Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria was the longest serving monarch. Now that period, 1837 to 1901, was the most disruptive over the native lives of Southern Africa. That's the period when they completed the conquest of the Eastern Cape, the final war being fought in 1878. But that's also the period in which they completed the conquest of Zululand. 1879, between January and June of that year, they finally defeated the Zulus. And King Xoli, Kampande of the Zulus, had to beg the British monarch for an allocation of land and also for the right to rule over the Zulu people. Ultimately, in an article I wrote recently, I described it as a relationship of subservience in which Xoli was ultimately left as a vassal king over a diminished empire.
Yeah. I'm going to bring us in finer detail as to what you think the legacy of the British monarchy has been on Southern Africa. But you must hold a strong view then about our own president's attendance at this funeral. Do you?
You know, I'm almost indifferent to whether he attends or doesn't attend. I don't think that his attendance is an endorsement of the conduct of the British royal family in Southern Africa. In the same way as I think even if he had not attended, there wouldn't be much difference. This is a much longer and a much larger struggle for Southern African native people than for it to be reduced to whether or not President Ramaphosa attends one funeral. I actually think it's largely inconsequential that he is there. I just noted this morning that there is probably less than 20 African heads of states out of 54 that bothered to show up. That shows how the event is largely insignificant to Africans.
So let's bring then those finer details about the impact and the legacy of the British royal family on the peoples of Southern Africa. If you were to put that into detail, what is it? What is that, as you put it in your article, that most consequential impact?
You see, it's significant. You know, although in my piece I focused only on Queen Victoria, we have to take it back to the 17th century, to Charles II. You know, now we have Charles III. But very few people actually know who Charles II was. Charles II established the Royal African Company. That's the company that began the slave trade from Africa to the Americas and to England, in places like Bristol, places like Manchester, places like Liverpool, and also in places like in the Caribbean.
This was the slave trade.
Yes, during the period where sugar was what we can call today the modern gold. Maybe today it's no longer even gold, maybe it's technology. But at the time, sugar was the white gold. It was what was driving global trade. And in the sugar plantations, the bodies that worked there were African bodies. Now, the company that was responsible for that was the company established by the royal family itself. So it is not a question merely of being complicit, but it's also being the leader in the pillaging and in the plundering of people. So that's an event of the 17th century. They continued throughout the 18th century, and they finalized the process of placing African land under British interests during the 19th century. And mostly the person who was responsible was Queen Victoria. And there were three primary modes of the placing of Southern Africa under the British sphere of influence. So the first one was slavery. Slavery ended, at least in law, in 1834. But 3 years later, Queen Victoria became Queen of England in 1837. But the practices associated with slavery simply transformed into some sort of the construction of a racial oligarchy in which the slave practices did not end as such, but the law of slavery ended. And Queen Victoria presided over that. But in addition to taking people, during that period they actually took land. They engaged in many, many wars. One of the most brutal wars in the Eastern Cape was fought between 1850 and 1853. One of the most brutal wars, in which ultimately the Xhosa people were forced to surrender and be placed under the control of the British. And by the way, 1836, 1837 are also significant for the Xhosas because that's the period in which Hintsa is killed. And they literally slaughter him and they chop off his head after they have cut off his ears and cut off pieces of his noses. And that head is unknown where it is. But it was people like Harry Smith who actually were responsible for the heinous crime of not only killing a man, but also of chopping off his head. So we have slavery, we have land, and then again, the last piece of the puzzle was minerals. In the 1860s to the 1880s, they so-called discovered, because actually African people had been trading in these precious minerals. The British then claimed to have discovered diamonds and gold. And there were two men that became super rich and created the current capitalist mode.
And we're going to talk about those names because you do mention them in the article. So impactful was the British rule over those it had conquered that in your article you mentioned that it even changed the language of protest among those who were the conquered. Explain that to us a little bit. It was, I think you were having a bit of fun there.
No, it's a fascinating development because what the British claimed they were doing when they were pillaging and plundering the African soil. They claimed that they were civilizing the barbarian races. Those are their terms, not mine. And by civilization, what they meant was that they would introduce education. They would make the two of us speak in English, just like now.
Yeah.
Instead of speaking in Xhosa or in Zulu. But they would also make us Christians, and it's part of civilization.
Yeah.
They would make me a Methodist. I don't know which church you go to. But religion or religious conversion was the second element of civilization. And the third one was that they would put a lot of us in public works. We would build roads, we would build buildings. And these roads and buildings were the signs of the power and the significance of the British Empire. So, if you go to one of the places that they did this in Grahamstown, you look at many of those buildings. They are mimicry, they are photocopies. It is as if you are in Victorian England. You look in Port Elizabeth right now, there is a statue of Queen Victoria. Go to Ngcukaitobi. The buildings look the same as the buildings we are looking at here. You go to Cape Town, in front of Parliament, there is a statue of Queen Victoria. Now, these are not just footnotes in history. They are a symbol of territorial possession and also political, social, and cultural control over the people. Now, that is why I use this phrase that even the language of protest mimicked the British aesthetics. If you look at the early ANC leaders who made petitions and deputations and delegations, what they wanted was to be classified as children of empire. He said, we want to be children of empire. And the reason why they said so was because they thought that if they are put as children of empire, they could be protected militarily from the invasion of the Boers, or that now today called Afrikaners. So I'm not trying to be offensive when I use Boers. But they thought that if they go to King George or Queen Victoria and they make a petition, and then there's an agreement in which they would be put under the British sphere of influence, they could be protected. So Lesotho is a good example, Basutoland. Swaziland is another good example. Botswana is another good example. That if you found yourself under the British sphere of influence, you could be protected from the invasion of the aggressive Afrikaners at the time. So there are many petitions in which the early founders of the ANC between 1912, probably it goes on up to the start of the First World War, or end of the First World War, 1918, in which they say, we beg to be children of empire.
I wonder whether today, if you were to ask the spokesperson of the ANC or any leader of the ANC, they would readily agree with how you characterize that whole issue of petitions. But I want to then touch on the issue of minerals, which you write about extensively in that article. So two names basically became synonymous with diamond trade and gold in the southern tip of Africa. Cecil John Rhodes and
Bani Banato.
Bani Banato. Explain to us how these men amassed their wealth.
Yes, I mean, firstly, these are both British citizens. And when they came to South Africa, they were not, Southern Africa, they were not wealthy. I mean, Rhodes began in Natal, and he ultimately ended up in the Cape, starting in Kimberley. Now, but the way that they began to obtain the wealth, again, was through pillaging. It was building a pillage economy. Because there was some sort of a trade in diamonds already taking place in Kimberley by the time Rhodes arrived. But what Rhodes was able to do, through the help of Bani Banato, who was able to raise the capital from American financiers, yes, what Rhodes was able to do was to commercialize the scale of diamond trade and to globalize it. But what that also required, it required formalization in pieces of paper and in law. And that is why Rhodes always thought that it was not only helpful to have economic power in the form of trade in diamond. He also thought what was necessary was to combine it with political power, which is why he then ran to become prime minister, ultimately combining, the first sort of proper capture of the state, ultimately combining the economic and the political. That way he could influence the Cape policy towards the natives. And there is a speech that Rhodes gives in the Cape Parliament in 1894, that's something like 3 or 4 years before his actual death, in which he protests at the laziness of the natives. And he says that most of them should be taken off the land in order to work in the mines. Look at the law that they passed in 1895, the Glen Grey Act. What was the impact of the Glen Grey Act? The impact of the Glen Grey Act was to reduce the size of the land. They had a strategy called one man, one plot. And by imposing the strategy of one man, one plot, what they were able to do, they were able to push large scores of able-bodied black men from the villages where they were self-sustaining into the mines where they could be turned into wage laborers, which is why the foundations of that economy today ultimately extended to Johannesburg. They then so-called discovered gold in Johannesburg. And they continued the pattern that they had established during the diamond trade in the Cape. For themselves, they became probably among the forerunners of the capitalist world order. South Africa became the largest country in dealing in gold, although it did not derive the benefits from it.
History lesson there. When we return, I'd like for you to talk us through the friction between the British and the Afrikaner, which you say consolidated at some point into what we later learned to be apartheid.
Yes,
of course. We'll continue the conversation in a moment. If you're just joining us, you find us right in the middle of a history lesson, if you will, in conversation with Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. He's a lawyer and author of a book called Land Matters, South Africa's Failed Land Reforms and the Road Ahead. Advocate, just before we went on a break, I wanted us to also touch on what you write about in the article, and that is the relationship, or should we say the friction, the friction between the British and the Afrikaner, which later in history we'll learn about the Anglo-Boer War, because that's what it culminates into. But then you say that, to use your words, this then consolidated into apartheid. Educate us a little bit on that.
Yes, the Afrikaners and the British have historically been foes, enemies. The Afrikaners who had occupied the Cape since 1652.
The Dutch East India Company.
The arrival of the Dutch East India Company under the commandership of Jan van Riebeeck on the 6th of April. So they had occupied the Table Bay area, and obviously over time they expanded into the Eastern Cape. The British effectively arrived and tried to put the Cape under their control between 1806 and 1810. And that is where the frictions sort of begin. But they are all intermittent. Matters come to a head in 1833, because at that point the British announced the end of slavery. And that instigates the Great Trek. The Boers decide to leave the Cape into the interior. One of their grievances, there is a lot of the grievances, one of the leaders of the Great Trek is Piet Retief. But one of the grievances is that they have been deprived their labor. And that labor is native labor.
Sure.
It's native labor. So they've been deprived their labor and they're leaving. And that's because of the end of slavery. Although, of course, that is not to excuse the conduct of the British, because even though the British claim to have ended slavery, they turned those slavery arrangements into apprenticeship agreements, which were all slavery but in name. Now, the Afrikaners who then leave, some of them end up in Natal, but the British immediately arrive in Natal, and the Afrikaners get involved in the deposing of Dingaan and the installation of Mbande, and they try to control them, to control Mbande, because they assist Mbande in the assassination of Dingaan. And the British arrive immediately thereafter, and they try to put Natal under the Cape. When Natal was put as a colony, it was initially put as a colony as an extension of the Cape, because it was ruled from the Cape by the British. The first Anglo-Boer War is actually not fought in 1899. It's actually in Transvaal, when the British first try to put Transvaal under British control, which they succeed. But obviously the most significant of these wars is the 1899 to 1901, which is largely a war fought over minerals. That's what the contest is about. It's about the minerals of the Transvaal. And the settlement is then arrived at. After 1901, they sign a deal. And the Boers, or the Afrikaners, have lost that war. But they then decide, the man who was sent by the British to be responsible for this is Alfred Milner. And the decision is then made that it is better to create a white oligarchy, right? And the most significant treaty here is the Treaty of Vereeniging. I think it's ultimately signed in 1907, the Treaty of Vereeniging. And in the Treaty of Vereeniging, they excluded the people that are outside, are native people, black people. And there the decision is taken that we've been fighting for too long, it's time for us to consolidate. And there is some sort of a division where the Afrikaners focus on running the state and the British focus on running the economy. And they largely control minerals. That lays the foundation, the Treaty of Vereeniging lays the foundation for what would happen 3 years later, in 1910, when the Union of South Africa was then born. And the Union is a combination of the two Boer republics, Orange Free State and the Transvaal, and the two British colonies, Natal and the Cape. And they then allocate for themselves political power with the seat of parliament in Cape Town, the seat of the executive in Transvaal, as well as judicial power with the seat in Orange Free State, and the economic power with its base in Johannesburg. But this is all a political deal arrived at in 1910.
With all of that history that you have just related to us, do you find it strange that some African leaders, recently, it was last week, I spoke to former president of Botswana, Ian Khama, who said that he would still like for his country to be under the Commonwealth group of countries. You have Kenya, which recently concluded its elections. They observed a number of days of mourning. These were all colonies of the British conquest in its quest to build a British empire. Do you find that strange that some leaders on the continent find that resonance?
Well, I think that my criticism is the sort of absence of historical critique of the British Empire. It is possible that people are now making strategic and tactical decisions about allegiances, because the fact of the matter is that Africa has not had that much of an impact in shaping the global world order, and that the global world order is still shaped by Europe, and to some extent Eastern Europe, Russia, and to some extent by China. And Africa's ability to influence the balance of political power globally is still very much limited. So what they tend to do is to find a place where they can affiliate. That is all understandable, and one shouldn't be too critical about that. But what is jarring is the kind of absence of historical critique in their decision to associate with the Commonwealth. And that's probably been the greatest success of Queen Elizabeth. It's been the ability to present an acceptable face of the British Empire. It's the ability to put the soft glove over the iron fist of empire.
And that's what I want us to conclude with when we return after the break. Let's conclude the conversation with Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who is also an author. Advocate, let's sum it all up now.
Yeah.
If you were to do that in perhaps 2 minutes,
yes,
what would you say has been the most consequential impact of British rule over the peoples of Africa?
Yes, mostly. Firstly, in South Africa specifically, I think that apartheid would not have been possible without British colonialism. You know, when the Afrikaners came, they found a much more diminished African population. And that strength, the power, was taken away by the British. So we have forgotten about that. We have forgotten about all of those 200 years, right, of dispossession, of building a pillage economy, of plundering. And then in certain instances of, I mean, if you look at someone like Harry Smith, who deliberately intended to cause a genocide, you know, and expressly said so, that he actually wanted to kill all of the, use the K word, from the Cape to Natal. So that we have forgotten largely because the ANC believes that, you know, history shouldn't be made compulsory. And I think that the second thing has been, so quite apart from the disruption of lives, you know, the second thing has been the disruption of an independent mode of existence. You know, the idea that virtually every black person, in order to make a living, depends on a wage economy. They do not depend on the natural resource, on the water, on the land, on the minerals, which are God-given, because those have been appropriated for the benefit of Europe. And then it's been building a racial oligarchy in which rich people are largely white-skinned. And that came about because they created race, not just as a so-called biological fact, but they created it as a political fact and as an economic fact. And race became something that defines access to resources.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at those three impacts that British colonialism has had in Africa, it's not difficult to understand why it's been so difficult to reverse all of this. Because we have been engaged with focusing on the symptoms. We have not been engaged in uprooting the system of British colonialism and changing it so that we have a country that works for its natives.
And what would uprooting that system mean? I'm now asking us to look ahead. Britain is going to come under a new monarch, King Charles III.
Yes.
And some people listening to conversations that are going on there, they are of the view that Charles and Camilla are perhaps the placeholders for William.
Yes.
Now, that's a young person, relatively young person, who surely cannot continue the same traditions. What becomes our role to unshackle ourselves?
I mean, there is, so the first thing for Charles III, if he wants to unshackle himself from the legacy of Charles II, who established the Royal African Company, which was responsible for the slave trade, is to apologize for slavery. The second thing for him is to think meaningfully about reparations. I seriously think that Africans have to start thinking meaningfully about what reparations might mean. They might mean money, but they might mean symbolic things. But the acknowledgement and ending the denialism, because the British royal family has been a master of adaptability and denialism. So ending the denialism about how the British disrupted native lives in Southern Africa could be a useful starting point.
When you say, I'm triggered by what you're saying, that they are the masters of adaptability.
Yes.
So the events of, I think it was November last year, Barbados,
yes,
being unshackled, if we use the term, from a constitutional monarchy into a republic. Was that adaptability?
Yes.
And you would know who presided over that.
Yes.
It was Charles.
Yes, of course. Yes, this is the mastery of adaptability. It's like when in this country in 1961 there was a pronouncement of a republic, but the British interests were not impacted. And we had a liberation in 1994, but the British interests were not impacted. So it's been this ability to adapt to new conditions in ways that ultimately protect the interests of the British. And that, for me, is largely a credit to Elizabeth II. It's been this ability to say one thing publicly, but the actual agents on the grounds are doing the opposite. But what is said publicly appears benign, acceptable.
Let's conclude the conversation, Advocate, and let me ask you about the UK's modern relations with countries of Africa. How do you see that relationship moving forward?
Well, you know how the British always present this language of strengthening trade relations between the UK and Africa. And when you actually look at the structural imbalance between Africa and Europe, you actually find that the trade is benefiting Europe, and specifically UK-based companies. So the one way of doing it might be to actually start re-examining the structural imbalances that exist in the trade and making sure that benefit actually also goes to Africa.
How do you do that successfully, Advocate? I want to challenge you on this. How do you do that successfully when we have living examples of what might be termed as punishment for going against, I suppose, the superpowers of this world, which Britain is key among them? Why do I say a living example? The people of Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
There is a particular relationship between Zimbabwe and Britain. Yes. You would remember the Lancaster agreement that Robert Mugabe sang about up until he went to the grave.
Yeah. And it was,
how do we redefine that?
Yeah, and it was Queen Victoria who gave the royal charter to Cecil John Rhodes to take over the land of the Ndebeles. No, I agree with you that it will be difficult, and I don't suggest that it will be easy. But what I'm asking for is a start, not asking for the end. I am asking for a start in acknowledgement that Africa is in part where it is today because of the British, and that part of the British wealth that it has amassed over the years is because they pillaged, they plundered people, they plundered land, they plundered minerals from Africa. And that's all we can ask for now, is at least is a start.
Lawyer and author, thank you very much for your time, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for that history lesson.